Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we take a look at the events from last night in the NBA and preview a suddenly big matchup for the Bucks against the Utah Jazz. Both teams enter an NBA worst 1-6. We dig into the matchup coming up after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen each and every day. And your favorite podcast now has a newsletter. Introducing the Locked On Bucks daily newsletter, your one-stop shop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That is lockedondaily.com, and start your day with the all-new free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Camille, since we last spoke, there is now another team that has entered the mix for the worst record in the NBA. And two of those three teams, if you would have told us before the season, hey, through the first 2 weeks of the regular season, these two teams are going to be tied for the worst record in the NBA, no one would have believed you, regardless of what some in the comments will say. If I saw this coming with the Bucks, no one would have thought the Bucks and 76ers would both be 1-6 and they combined 2-12. So we will take a look at some of the comparisons between the Bucks and Sixers. I think there's been one constant between the two, but some certainly differences. It makes tonight's game against Utah all the more interesting because I should point out the Jazz are the third team that's 1-6. We talked about this yesterday. I don't like hyperbole. And I hate whenever you hear it's a must-win game, like Game 7. Elimination games are must-win.
That's a must-win.
It kind of feels like it's a must-win game because, as we pointed to, the schedule, especially these first 10 games. So after the Jazz game, oh, by the way, another back-to-back tomorrow in New York. We'll get to that next team in a second. And then the Celtics, who lost last night, but lost to a team that looks pretty good so far this season, Golden State Warriors. So it's not easier after that. And you lose this game, you are staring directly into the eyes of a 1-9 start to the season, which we said don't panic after 1-6. I'm not panicked at 1-9, but I got to tell you, my hand is starting to hover over that button.
Which would be fair. One thing about the start to this season that I have taken some solace in is the fact that the team itself doesn't seem like they're falling apart. They seem very together still, and they seem very confident in their abilities to turn it around. We've heard them mention the fact that, a lot of teams go on losing streaks. Ours just happened to be at the beginning of the season, but we're confident. We feel good about what we have in this building. We're ready to go. And I take some solace in that, in addition to the fact of seeing them play better against Cleveland over their last two, seeing them play better against Boston. They had that Memphis stinker in between those two teams there, but I do take some solace in seeing the improvement in those games, but you got to start turning that process into wins. I just keep coming back to that. Yes, we don't want to say must-win game in the beginning of November for a Bucks team here, but this is a team, the Jazz, that you are expected to beat, regardless of you having the same record. The talent on the two teams is not the same. Expectations for the two teams coming into this season and currently still during this season are not the same. So this is a Jazz team that just got their first win against the Bulls, I believe that it was. And, they're feeling pretty good about themselves. They have been the worst offense in the NBA. Worst, and their win that they just had bumped them up because they were averaging under 100 points per possession on offense before they got that victory, that big win. The Bucks have to take care of business because, again, you have a little bit of luck on your side, given the fact that no other teams are above 500 in the East outside of the Celtics and the Cavs. But you can't continue to count on that. Now you got to start making some of your own luck with some wins.
I've said it before a number of times to the point that people are probably annoyed, like, hey, pick a new phrase. But I mean, it's true. You have to be an active participant in your own rescue. So I agree with everything we've heard come out of the locker room, in that, hey, teams go through these stretches, teams go through losing streaks. Ours just happening as the season starts, which brings even more attention to it. That's great. I do believe that, but you have to turn it around. Like, you have to end the losing streak, and you have to start to build on it. I mean, we've heard Doc Rivers very optimistic. If you wanted to be the devil's advocate, you would say, well, what's the coach supposed to say? Like, hey, we're cooked, man. It's over. I'm regretting this. I wish I was in Dalton and hanging out with Mike Breen. But he said, even before those losses, I think before the Grizzlies game, which, yeah, I mean, if there's one take back on it, it was, yeah, maybe I should use this before the first Cavs game, but said, look, I like what I'm starting to see, and I do feel like we're going to go on a run here, and I think it's going to be relatively soon. I think you could see that in those two games against Cleveland, where it was, okay, they are starting to figure some things out. We talked on yesterday's show. If you missed that, go back and take a listen to the urgency, I guess, in increasing the minutes for players like Andre Jackson Jr. and AJ Green. And I did see a few people pointed out too, which we didn't really mention, but he did play well in that game. Hey, I stopped there. Like, I liked what I saw from Ryan Rollins. Is this the case? Yeah. Especially if, as Doc has kind of hinted at and tiptoed around, you know, DeLon Wright still battling through something and not 100%. We saw his minutes drastically reduced in that second game against Cleveland. But to that point, like, all right, let's continue to ride that hot hand. Let's see what Ryan Rollins can give this group. So it has started to reach that point where we're saying it's not time to panic, at least yet, but it is time to reconsider and say, okay, we kind of knew this would be a possibility coming into the season. Now I think we've been given the answers of, yes, we do need to play some of these guys more and get more athletic, get quicker, get younger, all of the above. And especially if they're earning the minutes, which, you know, there's no denying they did on what, Monday night against Cleveland.
And that's the part. Doc in his presser yesterday, that stood out to me. He mentioned the fact that, you know, coming into camp, AJ Green was far ahead in the rotation. He did not have a good camp. He did not have a good preseason, and therefore he lost some of his minutes to some of the vets who were performing better at that time. Of course, we talked about it all summer, how the Bucks were talking so highly of AJ Green and all that he's done. But in order to get the minutes, you have to show that you earned those minutes consistently. And I think over the last few games, and Doc mentioned even in practice, you've been seeing AJ making his case, like, I need my minutes back. Like, I need to be back into this rotation. Yeah. He mentioned the same thing with Andre Jackson Jr., where they were in good spots, but coming into camp, training camp, wasn't looking as good. So they lost those minutes before the season even began. But what I love about how Doc is approaching this, at least what he's telling us publicly, is the fact that guys can come and earn their minutes back. So if you're showing in game, in practice, that you deserve to be on the floor, he's going to find a way to get you on the floor. And it sounds like right now, AJ Green and Andre Jackson Jr. are two players who are on that trajectory. He also mentioned Ryan Rollins of doing some good work as well. So maybe we start to see more of them. And if they can stack success in their appearances when they're in the game, I would guess you can bet on seeing them perform in more games and get more minutes going forward as well. So that's something to keep an eye on. They just have to make sure that when they're in the game, that they're making the most of their minutes. And based on what we saw in Cleveland, they've definitely earned the stake in this upcoming game against the Jazz.
So it comes down to tonight against the Utah Jazz, a game that you need to expect to win. And these are the games that have given the Bucks a lot of difficulty in the past. I do want to take a look at this a little bit, but I think the bigger talking point here is what we're seeing league-wide. And we touched on the conference as a whole, just two teams above 500. Both of those teams look very, very good so far. But there is one partner the Bucks have found now at the bottom of the conference. So what are some of the differences between the Bucks and the 76ers? Which fan base should feel worse? And what is the path forward here for both of these teams. So Camille and I will get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. Well, time to talk to you now about Skims. Look, I don't know about the rest of you guys. I'm very particular about my undergarments. When you find the right pair, you just load up on it and continue to buy those. I went through that a couple of years ago. I found one that was just perfect and then went out of business. So I had to move on to something else. But Skims is that new replacement. When I found out they were making underwear for men, I was pretty excited, as it's been on the other side of the aisle for a while. I've heard other people rave about it, and now we get to experience this ourselves. Skims is underwear that you'll wear daily and feel as though this is your favorite pair. The fabric that they use, everything involved with it, with the stretch boxer brief, cotton brief as well. Multiple options to choose from Skims. Shop for Skims at men's at skims.com. Let them know we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select our show in the drop-down menu that follows. And if you're looking for the perfect gifts for the whole family, Skims just launched their biggest holiday shop ever. Also available at skims.com. So head over to skims.com today and find your new favorite pair of underwear. All right, Camille. And I mean, this is going to be unavoidable as we see popping up in the comments. Hey, look at what Phoenix is doing. I think we prepared ourselves for that. Mike Budenholzer is a very, very good coach. This now isn't the time to relitigate what should have happened there. We expect a lot of change regardless of what happens, or at least a decent amount of change regardless of what happens this season in the offseason. And I think that's when you really open it up to a retrospective of everything that happened. Look, I expected the Suns to be good. We know Bud is a very good coach, and I think we're all rooting for Mike Budenholzer. What's happened since then has certainly been suboptimal, but the Bucks now have some partners down there in the Philadelphia 76ers. And look, I think the knee-jerk reaction is going to be, well, the Bucks are in a worse spot than Philly. Joel Embiid has not played yet. He's not going to make his season debut until Tuesday. Convenient how that works, that he gets suspended and he's immediately ready to play, and now he's going to serve that and come back on Tuesday. But I think the immediate reaction is, well, are you kidding me? The Bucks are in a worse spot. Like, Embiid hasn't played. That's why Philly's 1-6. And there's a modicum of truth to that. I think you could make a case the Bucks are in a better spot, not significantly better. But the thing, let's just unpack that part. Joel Embiid has not played in the first 7 games. True. Paul George missed 5? That's going to take time for Paul George to get assimilated with this group. We experienced it last year with this team. That's one of the major questions I have over, look, if you're saying Philly has a higher ceiling than the Bucks, sure, I will grant you that. But just the course of the regular season, that is going to continue to be a process to get that group to fit when the whole roster was remade overnight. Joel Embiid hasn't played. Right. It's the same conversation we've had with Chris Middleton, and people will point out Chris Middleton doesn't play either. Fine. If we're saying you can't expect either of these guys to play in more than 45 games this season, which is pretty dire in Chris Middleton terms. But if that's what we're going into it with, who's more important to have on their team, on the floor, between the two? So that's where I'm coming from when I say not so fast. I do see a path forward for the Bucks. There certainly is a path forward for the Sixers. If you want to say, I like Philly better in the playoffs, fine, but neither of these teams have a sterling track record the last 2 years. And as we've seen, you can talk about ceilings all you want, but availability is the best ability there is. So you have to be available when you get to that moment in April. And frankly, neither of these teams have been able to answer that call the last 2 years. So I don't think this is cut and dry. Well, Philly's in a better spot than the Bucks are because Joel Embiid hasn't played.
Which is fair. I think one thing that I would say to that would probably make Philly fans feel better about their team over the Bucks right now is that at least they know when Embiid is returning. At this point, the Bucks have still been kind of tight-lipped about Chris Middleton's return, outside of the fact that it's just taken a bit longer than what they expected for it to be. But we know Embiid is going to be back on the court for them on Tuesday, ready to go. But again, I caution this because it does take time for teams to come together generally when you haven't been used to playing with certain guys. And this is going to be the first year of Embiid with Paul George, with Tyrese Maxey. And Maxey is a guy who's been really interesting this season to me, because when it was just him out there without Paul George, without Joel Embiid, he was clearly every game the other team's defensive focus. They were trying to stop Tyrese Maxey at all costs necessary. And for Maxey, it's been a somewhat inefficient year for him so far. I think in part because he's just had to carry such a heavy offensive load. You've seen with Paul George back in the game for Philly that he kind of can slide back into not being as aggressive, but picking his spots a little bit more. And then when Paul George heads to the bench, you see him back out there being like, it's my show. I'm going to be really aggressive and trying to get to it. So like Philly, surprised to see that they're 1-6 along with the Milwaukee Bucks. But again, they know Embiid's coming back. They have some things that they can continue to try to work on. But when you're looking just at the numbers in itself, like the 76ers have a worse net rating than the Bucks do. They've been
Camille, you stole my thunder.
Hey, there we go. I went to the stats on you, Justin. They lost the worst net rating.
I was going to ask you, like, look, it's 7 games, small sample size theater, huge caveats of no Chris and no Embiid. But which of these teams would you think has the worst net rating? Which would you think has the worst offensive rating? Which would you think has the worst defensive rating? Spoiler alert, it's Philadelphia in every single one of those.
It is. So
like the defensive rating is what jumps out the most because, yeah, there's no Joel Embiid, but you brought in other pieces. And yeah, Paul George is going to help you, but he's missed 5 games. But other pieces that you brought in to improve your rebounding and defense, and the 76ers have a much worse defense by the numbers than the Bucks.
Yeah, they do. So it's one of those things where you're looking at it. And Philly's team, when you look at it, it was like they brought in a lot of defensive guys to come and I thought they'd be able to cobble together some really good defense, even if
just
they
like
are
grind out wins. Yeah,
exactly. Even if they are missing an Embiid or a Paul George from game to game. But what we have seen is just the size aspect of the 76ers as well, not working in their favor. But again, I didn't expect either Philly nor Milwaukee to be 1-6 at this point, but I think both fan bases can look at it and say, hey, it's early, as we alluded to already and talked about. There's only 2 teams above 500. You're just a few games out of being in that top 4 seed. Keep going at it. But as a Bucks fan, someone who's has a now financial interest in the team as well, doing well, I see that pathway going forward for them where I'm like, it sucks to be 1-6, but I feel really good about them going forward. I feel better about the Bucks going forward than I do Philly at the moment, just given the fact that I got some questions around that supporting cast in Philly. One could argue the same in Milwaukee, but I think Milwaukee's starting to find some solutions to that supporting cast. If AJ Green and Andre Jackson Jr. are 2 guys who can play consistent for the Bucks.
I may have misspoke too. It's not significantly worse. It is slightly worse. There's some other areas you can look at where it is a lot worse than what the your raw advanced stats NBA.com will tell you. Like the Bucks, believe it or not, have been a better half-court defense than the 76ers all season long. And Joel Embiid, that's the biggest part. Joel Embiid is going to help them a lot more in the half court. Transition, they've been relatively even, which is an area you would have expected. Hey, they at least have more guys and switchable guys that are going to be able to get back in defense. So the point of all of this is it's been a disaster for both of these teams to start the season. Like they would have expected the inverse, that they're both 6-1 versus 1-6 to start the season. But it's not over for either of these teams. Now, we can only say that for so long, right, Camille? That if we are talking about 1-9, it's not over, but you start to reassess, okay, what is the actual ceiling for this team? Because the interesting part of all of this is, and I still, bad job by me, did not go back and research who are those 12 teams that started 1-6 to make the playoffs. I know one was a Sonics team that made the finals, but nobody's running away with this. And not only that, the Cavs and Celtics are, I should say, but the conference as a whole, has not been what we expected to see. Like, you have two teams that are 500, two teams that are above 500. The Atlanta Hawks look pretty frisky so far. They're the 5 seed. And, as we mentioned, the Hornets are in the mix of things. The Bulls are in the mix of things. The Wizards, the Pistons have won more games. The Pistons have won 3 times as many games as the Bucks. So neither the Bucks nor Sixers expected to be looking up in the standings and see Hornets, Wizards, Pistons, Raptors.
Right.
But here's where we are. But I think that's a good thing because, as I think a few comments have pointed out, what the Bucks are, like 3.5 games out of being one of the top 3 seeds, or 3 games out of that mix. That's the benefit of just 2 teams really looking solid to start the season. That, as disappointing as this start has been and this losing streak has been, you do the opposite, and it doesn't even have to be a 6-game win streak. Like, eventually, you're going to have to, you're going to have to move that needle past 500, but you just start to piece some wins together here, and that's going to go a long way in turning things around. 2.5 games out of the 3 seed are the Bucks right now. So it's still very early. It's too early to panic. But that being said, we got to start to see the results here. Like tonight, especially against the Utah Jazz, I'm not going to use must win, but you have to win this game tonight. So we'll take a little bit of a look at that matchup. And one other thing to throw out there, just in terms of this immediate schedule for the Bucks. We'll get into that coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at FanDuel, as you can get ready to tackle the NFL action with America's #1 sports book. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL, all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to join, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So one quick thing to throw out there, Camille, is, we just mentioned the standings and how it looks. I still would be willing to bet. Well, I shouldn't say that. I'm not allowed to bet on the NBA, but I'd still be willing to tell you the Brooklyn Nets are not going to be in the playoff mix when the season ends. The Charlotte Hornets, maybe they hang around in the play-in tournament. So right there's 2 teams that, okay, if we look at the rest of the group, who's going to get in there? The Bucks and Sixers are both making the playoffs. I mean, I know there was some backlash to it when Doc adamantly said, we're making the playoffs. I'm not worried about that. But they are going to make the playoffs. The 1-6 start, as disappointing is probably even too soft of a word to use, but as much as it has been, just as we said, okay, you have to start to turn this around. So with the loss last night that the Knicks suffered to those Atlanta Hawks, if you win your next 2 games, tonight against the Jazz, tomorrow night on the road against the Knicks, if you win those 2 games, you're 3-6. The Knicks would be 3-5. Like, how much does that start to shape the narrative and change of, you know what? We're a half game back of the Knicks for how dreadful this season has been. And again, that persists with the Knicks too. Like, there's still questions there over how much depth is there, especially when you look at some of the minutes played last night in that game where they remain just 8 deep. Camille, your guy, Tyler Kolex, playing 10 minutes a night for the Knicks. Like, that's where they're at with some of these trades in the offseason. And to go back to that Philly piece that we experienced last year, it has never flipped the switch. And you can throw Drew Holiday in my face. That's fine. Drew Holiday was not expected to carry that offense. Drew Holiday was a plug-and-play player. We saw the same thing when he came to Milwaukee. Just come here. You're the 4th option. He was not the 4th option here. I know that. Yeah. But with Boston, you're the 4th option, play defense, perfect fit. Karl Anthony Towns is not Drew Holiday, right? Paul George and the rest, 70% of your roster, is not Drew Holiday. That's what we've experienced from the Brooklyn Nets when they reshaped their roster. that team never figured it out. And that all along was my one, not hesitation, but back in your mind thing of this may be a 2 to 3 year thing for the Bucks because of those scenarios where it just super teams, it takes time for those teams to develop. But unfortunately for the Bucks, you don't have time. So that's kind of where we're at. But as I think we've learned, there's a lot of teams that are kind of dealing with some form of issues. Celtics are the reigning champions. They kept the whole group together. The Cavs did the same thing and changed their coach. And those are the two teams that look to be the best.
Yeah, I mean, the time is now. Word to John Cena to try to figure some things out for the Bucks. Had to get it in there, Justin, as soon as you talk about the time. Time is now for the Bucks to start turning that around because, as you mentioned, a lot of teams are trying to figure it out. It's still early in the season. We have seen teams get off to fast starts and falter down the stretch. We've seen the opposite. We've seen teams start slow and find a way to be someone.
2021 Bucks.
Yeah, I mean, even last year with the Dallas Mavericks, after the trade deadline, once they made a few different moves and they started really clicking together, they started rolling to end last season. Did not look anything like the same team that they had to start the year. We saw it 2 years ago with the Lakers starting 2-10, ended up in the Western Conference Finals that year. So, like, sometimes it takes time.
They reshaped the roster.
Right? They did too. But like sometimes it takes a little time. You got to figure it out as well. And also during this time period of figuring it out, I would imagine that Doc in the front office is taking a look at what they currently have on the team, and they're thinking, hey, next month, a lot more contracts become available to be traded. Hey, is there any singular or maybe two separate moves that we can make that would improve our team going forward? What we need, because after you have a bigger sample size, you can really see some of the warts on your team and say like, hey, we've been talking about this. This isn't getting better. We need to make a move here. Woo-woo. So they have that aspect for them as well. But for the Bucks, again, that's in the future. Like, again, you can take a look at the roster, figure things out, say, hey, are there any moves around the margins we can make to improve the team around Dame and Giannis? Hopefully Chris, gets back on the court soon. But with all of that being said, again, you have got to try to get a win tonight, especially against this Jazz team that's been a little banged up. At the time of us recording this, we don't have the full injury report. We know that Lauri Markkanen and Jordan Clarkson are both questionable for tonight, as well as Isaiah Collier. So we'll see if they actually go or not. Giannis is questionable tonight, but we did hear Doc mention the fact that against Cleveland, it was my call. Like, Giannis probably could have played, but I said, no, it's not worth it. We don't need to. It's a marathon. Like, we don't have to rush it. So something to keep an eye on for tonight's game against the Jazz. But even if Giannis does not go against the Jazz, that does not change how I feel about how the Bucks should come out in this game and should win.
And some of the availability is going to be interesting because, we've heard Doc insinuate he'd love to play smaller. We saw that for stretches against the Cavs. And then ultimately, when they went back to their Twin Towers, you just couldn't do it. I know a few people pointed out, like, well, why not? You force them to make that change. Well, they're doing the same thing of they're forcing you to make the change, and they're going to gobble up every rebound and just make life difficult. So you do have to try to strike a balance in that. And that's what we saw there for the Cavs and the Bucks in that game. Going back to your point as we start to wrap here, though, about teams that took some time and they started to piece it together. Last year's Dallas Mavericks, at the time the Bucks made their coaching change and fired Adrian Griffin, the Mavs had played 44 games. What would you think their record was?
Probably a couple games over 500 at that point. So what, maybe like 24-20?
Nailed it on the head. 24-20. The Mavs were when the time that the Bucks fired Griff, the Mavs were 24-20. And look what happened after that. And granted, they made some nice moves at the trade deadline, but that team was slowly starting to figure it out. It was shortly after that point they went on a 7-game win streak. And then just the way they closed the season to go from 24-20 to 50-32. Like, these processes take time. I know it's been annoying to hear, and I know it's frustrating. Look, we heard that last year, and I get it. But it's just what it is. And I think the fact that there are two teams that appear to be juggernauts in the conference, and no one else has seemingly pieced it together, is what makes this, I don't want to use the word easy, but an easier path forward for the Bucks. A not quite as deep of a hole
Mhm.
to dig out of, even though it's 1-6 and it's certainly not ideal. But just as we mentioned, you're 2.5 games out of the 3 seed. It's still early in the season. There's that. There's win these next 2 games. You're just a half game behind the Knicks. And are we having the same conversations over, man, what's wrong with the Knicks? So all of it is just to illustrate it's still very early. There's still a lot of opportunities in front of
Mhm.
you, but we can't keep having this conversation next week, 2 weeks from
Yep.
now. Like, the longer this goes on, obviously the less early it is. And then the more I have some serious questions here. And I don't know if it's simple as tweaking the rotations or making some type of move that you can, as you referenced, once you get to December 15th and contracts become
Mhm.
more movable. But the longer we're having this conversation, the more all of that just becomes moot.
Yeah, it does. So again, it's this time period in the world right now where it's like, okay, it's November 7th. We are still saying like, hey, you got time, you can figure it out. But again, if the Bucks continue to lose games that you expect them to win, or they're losing in ways that are just like, this does not look like there's a fix for this team at the moment. Like if you're seeing them still getting beat in transition, still being able not to clean up offensive rebounds from the other team, which they have improved on, we should point out. But like if you start seeing those words pop up again, like when we can't say like there's more time, or they can still figure it out when it's end of November going into December. Like at that point, you have to have something more concrete to go forward with for this team. And as we've already heard with the season getting off to the start that it has, been a lot of chatter about what the Bucks are going to do and if Giannis is happy here. But shout out to Bobby Marks on ESPN coming through with the report saying like, no, there's no word around the Bucks that Giannis is looking for a trade. There's no word that the Bucks are looking to trade Giannis. So shout out to Bobby Marks on that as well for just coming through and being like, hey, nah, this isn't something that the Bucks are looking to do right now, but they do have to start to figure it out soon. So I still, at this moment, still feel all right about the Bucks, still feel a sense of optimism. There are still things that I saw in the offseason, how the team was being constructed and put together, where I'm like, I feel really good about this team's prospects that I can still see. I do think that Giannis and Dame on court together have looked better this season. I do think that the free agent additions to this team have still been a benefit, waiting for Gary Trent Jr. to find that shot. And I'm expecting that that's going to happen at some point for him as well. He's a better shooter than what we've been seeing. So again, there's a pathway forward for the Bucks. It starts tonight against Utah, where it's like, come out, play the way you need to, get a win, and get that ball rolling.
Waiting for Gary Trent Jr. to get that shot going. It's going to happen too. Like as Doc said too, he's been a great shooter his whole career. It's not like it just escapes you overnight. So it's going to come. We've talked before too about his usage is different with this team. And that's just kind of the role of being the 2 guard on the Bucks, that most of it is play defense and wait for your shots in the corner. And that's not how Gary Trent Jr. has played throughout his career. So I think that's part of the process that you're seeing as well. And to that point too, about, Bobby Marks, I just like, I'm not saying you, Camille, but there's other things to worry about than just spending time fretting over these hypotheticals that aren't even there yet. Like this week alone, there's more to be in serious worry over than I wonder, is some team going to come calling for Giannis, and is he going to ask out? Like, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, but we're not even close to reaching that river just yet. So it is a big one tonight. We're not going to sugarcoat that. Like, the tone of the postgame show, if that's a loss, is going to be much different than what you and I have laid out and discussed here tonight. So, I mean, I'll stop short of using must win, but it's like when you bring out the chain crew and you measure and it's just one link on the chain. Like that's where we're at in calling this a must win game. So you got to start to see this turnaround. You love what you saw in 2 games against the Cavs. You love what you saw in 3 quarters against the Boston Celtics. And look, it's not horseshoes and hand grenades. I get that. But if they win one of those games, even where you're 2-5, or if they win those 2 games against the Bulls and the Nets, which they should have, there's people that are questioning where this team is headed, but it's nowhere near what we're starting to hear right now. And that's just goes to show you small sample sizes early in the regular season and what they can mean. Like, I'm not saying it hasn't been troublesome what you've seen defensively at times in other places, but the big picture, that's kind of what we're dealing with right now. So hopefully this is the start of the opposite in a 6-game or more win streak, as Doc Rivers remains confident this team is going to go on a run. That'll do it for today's show, though. We got the post-game show coming up tonight. Hopefully it's great vibes on the post-game show. So we hope for that. That'll do it for today, though. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.